The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. Chapter 1. Christmas Eve. My name is Arthur Kipps. When I was a young man, I worked in London. I was a solicitor. I worked for the same company all my life. 14 years ago, I bought this house called Monk's Peace. I live here with my dear wife, Esme. Esme's first husband had died. She was a widow when I married her. I became the father of her 4 young children. Our years at Monk's Peace have been happy ones. It was Christmas Eve. All the family were at Monk's Peace for the holiday. We were all sitting by the big fire at the end of the day. I was in my armchair, listening to the laughter and the talking. "Wake up, Father!" someone called. "We're going to tell ghost stories." The lights were turned off. Suddenly the room was dark and shadowy. I smiled as I listened to the young people's stories. The stories were full of horror, but they did not frighten me. They were not true. Then I remembered. I remembered terrible things. These memories were terrible because they were true. "Tell us a ghost story, Father," someone cried. "You must know one story." I stood up, cold and shaking. "No, no," I shouted. "I have no story to tell." I hurried from the room, away from them all. I went out into the garden. I stood there in the cold and in the darkness. My heart was beating fast. I was shaking with fear. Will I never forget? Will I never find peace? How can I find peace? There is only one way. I must write down my terrible story. All the horror, everything. Then I will find peace. I turned and walked back into the house. Chapter 2. London Fog. My story begins in November many years ago. I was a young man of 23. I worked for a solicitor called Mr. Bentley. Sometimes the work was uninteresting, but I worked hard. I wanted to do well. That November morning, the weather was cold. A thick, yellow fog covered London. The fog filled people's ears and eyes. It got into houses, shops, and offices. Mr. Bentley called me into his office. "Sit down, Arthur, sit down," Mr. Bentley said. He pointed to a paper on his desk. "This is the will of Mrs. Drablow, Mrs. Alice Drablow of Eel Marsh House in Yorkshire. A strange old lady and a strange house. Have you ever been to Yorkshire, Arthur?" "No, sir." "Well, my boy, go home and pack your bag. Mrs. Drablow is dead. She has no relatives in England, and we are her solicitors. I want you to go to the funeral." Mr. Bentley saw that I was surprised. "I can't go myself," Mr. Bentley said quickly. "I'm too busy. After the funeral," he went on, "I want you to go to Eel Marsh House. I want you to look at the old lady's papers. Bring back anything important." Mr. Bentley stood up. "The funeral's at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said. "Take the afternoon train from King's Cross Station. Here is the key to Eel Marsh House. Mrs. Drablow's will and other important papers are in this envelope." And he held out a large brown envelope. Written on the front of the envelope was, "Mrs. Alice Drablow, Eel Marsh House, 9 Lives Causeway, Crythin Gifford, Yorkshire." "What a strange address," I said. "Yes, it's a strange address, And it's a strange place," Mr. Bentley said. "Now, off you go, my boy." There wasn't much time to get ready for the journey. I quickly packed my bag. Then I wrote a note to Stella, my fiancée. Then I set off for King's Cross Station. The fog was thicker now. The smell of fog was everywhere. At last I reached the big, noisy station. I was beginning to feel excited. I was going on a journey. I had an important job to do. I was soon sitting in the train, and then it was moving. Slowly at first, and then faster. The fog of London was left behind. Darkness fell. I was on my way north to Eel Marsh House. I changed trains at Crewe. Then I changed trains again at a small town called Homerby in Yorkshire. The air was cold. The wind blew rain on my face. The little train I got into at Homerby was old and dirty. I put the brown envelope on the seat beside me. I opened my newspaper and began to read. A few minutes later, a big man with a red face got into the carriage. He sat down as the train began to move out of Homerby. "It's cold in here," I said, "but I've left the fog of London behind me." "We don't have fogs here. We have mists. The mists come in from the sea," the big man said. We sat for a few moments in silence. Then I saw the big man look at the envelope on the seat beside me. "Drablow," he said. "Are you a relative?" "No, I'm a solicitor," I said. "I'm going to the funeral." "You'll be the only one there, Mr.—" "My name's Kipps, Arthur Kipps," I told him. "I'm Samuel Daly," the big man said. "Didn't Mrs. Drablow have any friends?" I asked. "No, she didn't have any friends," Mr. Daly said. "People become strange when they live in strange places." I smiled. "Are you trying to frighten me, Mr. Daly?" I asked. He stared at me. "No, I'm not trying to frighten you," he said. "But there are other people in Crithon Gifford who will try to frighten you." I suddenly felt very cold. "Where are you staying tonight?" Mr. Daly asked me. "I'm going to stay at the Gifford Arms." "The Gifford Arms is a comfortable inn," said Mr. Daly. "I go past it on my way home. You can come with me in my car." Mr. Daly's car was waiting at the station. A few minutes later, it stopped outside the inn. Mr. Daly gave me his card with his address on it. "That's where I live," he said. "If you need any help, come and see me." The Gifford Arms was warm and comfortable. After a good supper, I went to bed. I slept well. Thank God I did. I never slept so well again. Chapter 3. The Funeral of Mrs. Drablow. The next morning was bright and sunny. I ate a good breakfast. Then I walked round the little town of Crithon Gifford. It was market day. The little town was busy. Farmers were buying and selling animals in the market square. The streets of Crithon Gifford were completely flat. The countryside all round the town was flat too. There were no hills at all. To the east of the town were the marshes, and on the marshes was Eel Marsh House. I walked back to the inn and got ready for the funeral. I put on a dark suit and went downstairs again. Mr. Jerome was waiting for me downstairs. Mr. Jerome was Mrs. Dablow's agent. He looked after her house and land. Mr. Jerome was a small man dressed in black. He smiled politely, and we left the inn. As we walked through the square, people stared at us. They stopped talking. No one smiled. The church stood in an old graveyard. There were old gravestones on either side of a long path. It was very cold inside the church. Mr. Jerome and I were the only people at the funeral. Poor Mrs. Drablow, I thought. Didn't she have any friends at all? Then I heard a sound behind me. I turned. A young woman was standing at the back of the church. She was dressed in old-fashioned black clothes of 60 years ago. A large, old-fashioned bonnet covered her face. She raised her head and looked at me. The young woman's face was white and very thin. How ill she looked. When we left the church, I looked for the woman, but I did not see her. Then, in the graveyard, I saw her again. In the sunshine, her face was whiter and thinner. I closed my eyes to pray. When I opened them, the woman had gone. Beyond the graveyard I saw the estuary, and beyond the estuary was the open sea. The funeral was over. I followed Mr. Jerome from the churchyard. "Who was that young woman?" I asked him. Mr. Jerome stopped and looked at me. "Young woman?" he said. "Yes, a young woman. She was dressed in black, and she looked very ill." Mr. Jerome's face went white. "I did not see a young woman," he said. I looked behind me. The young woman was standing beside Mrs. Drablow's grave. "Look, there she is," I said. Mr. Jerome made a strange sound. He did not turn round to look at the woman. He held my arm tightly. He began to shake. "Mr. Jerome!" I cried. "Are you ill? Let go of my arm, and I'll bring a car for you." "No, no!" he cried. "No, sir. Stay with me." After a few moments, Mr. Jerome spoke again. "I'm very sorry, sir," he said quietly. "I felt ill for a moment. I can go on now." We walked slowly back to the Gifford Arms. "Are you taking me to Eel Marsh House, Mr. Jerome?" I said politely. The little man shook his head. "No, not me," he said. "Keckwick will take you. You have to go across a causeway to get to Eel Marsh House. When the tide is in, the sea covers the causeway. You can't get across. You can only cross the causeway when the tide is out. That will be after 1 o'clock. "There may be a lot of papers to look at," I said. "I may stay in Eel Marsh House tonight." "You will find the inn more comfortable," Mr. Jerome said quietly. "Perhaps you are right," I said. The lunch at the Gifford Arms was a good one, and I ate well. At 1:30, I was waiting outside the inn. The key to Eel Marsh House was in my pocket. I listened for the sound of Keckwick's car. Chapter 4. Eel Marsh House. After a few minutes, a pony and trap came into the square. It stopped beside me. "Mr. Kipps," the driver said. "Are you Keckwick?" I asked. I was surprised that Keckwick did not come in a car. The man nodded his head. I got into the trap. The ponies started off at once. We drove quickly through the quiet little town. We passed the churchyard and were soon in open country. The country around the town was completely flat. There was a beautiful grey sky above us. After a time we reached the marshes. The marshes were strange and beautiful. No trees grew in the marshes. There was water everywhere. There were no people and no houses. There was silence. The only sound was the noise made by the hooves of the pony and the wheels of the trap. We drove along the path until we came to the causeway. The long causeway went across the estuary. The sandy causeway was not much higher than the water on each side. This is Nine Lives Causeway, I thought. At high tide, the water will completely cover it. The bright winter sun shone in my eyes. I shut them for a moment. When I opened my eyes, we were near the end of the causeway. In front of us was a tall grey house. It stood alone, looking over the marshes and the water of the estuary. The lonely house was on a little island. This was Eel Marsh House. The trap stopped in front of the house. For a few moments I did not move. What a strange, lonely place! But the place was so beautiful that I did not feel afraid. I got out of the trap. "When will the water cover the causeway again?" "In 2 hours," Keckwick answered. I did not want to leave so soon. I wanted more time in this beautiful place. 2 hours won't be enough time for me to do my work here, I said. I'll come back here again tomorrow. I'll bring food and drink with me and stay for a day or 2. But now that I'm here, I'll have a look round the house. What are you going to do? Will you wait here or come back for me later?" Keckwick did not answer. He turned the pony and trap round and drove off. I watched the trap going back across the causeway. I was alone. I stood there without moving. The key to the house was in my hand. A seabird flew by. It gave a cry. Then there was silence again. What a place to live, I thought. Perhaps one day Stella and I will stay here. I wanted to be with her in this beautiful place. There was a field behind the house. It went from the house to the water. The setting sun made the water red. The wind from the sea was getting colder. At the end of the field, I saw a little church. It looked very old. It had no roof, and its walls were broken. Some old gravestones stood round the old building. It was beginning to grow dark. It was time to go inside the house. And then I saw the young woman again. She was standing beside one of the gravestones. It was the woman in black. She was wearing the same old-fashioned clothes. She looked pale and ill. Her eyes were dark in her pale face. Those eyes! How can I describe them? Her eyes were evil. They stared at me with a terrible hate. There was something the woman wanted from me, something she had lost. What was it? I began to shake with fear. I felt very cold. My heart beat faster and faster. I wanted to run, but I was not able to move. What was wrong with me? The woman stepped behind the gravestone. She had gone. My fear left me. I ran down into the graveyard. I looked for the young woman everywhere, but she had disappeared. There were the marshes, and there was the shining causeway. I was able to see for miles, but there were no houses. There was no place to hide. I did not understand it. Suddenly my fear returned. I ran back to the house. I did not look back. I was too frightened to look back. I reached the house and tried to open the door. My hand was shaking. At last the key was in the lock. I opened the door and stepped inside. The door shut with a bang. The sound went through the empty house. What had happened to me? Who was the woman in black? I did not believe in ghosts, but I had seen one. A ghost that was evil and terrible. But I was inside the house now. I was safe. I smiled. I did not believe in ghosts. I had work to do, and I wanted to do it well. I must forget the woman in black. I looked around. I was standing in a dark hallway. In front of me was a wide staircase. On one side was a passage. Perhaps it led to the kitchen. There were several doors, all of them closed. It was getting darker. I switched on a light in the hall. I went to the nearest door and opened it. I then opened one door after another. One door was locked. There was old furniture in every room. It was all large and heavy. There were old pictures on all the walls. Every room had desks and cupboards. And my job was to look through all of them. There was a damp smell in the house. Some of the rooms had not been used for many years. The whole house was dark and shadowy. Mrs. Drablow had lived here alone, I thought. I was not surprised that people said she was strange. I pulled up the blinds at every window. From each window I was able to see the marshes and the estuary. It was a beautiful place, but silent and lonely. I used the keys to open some desks and cupboards. All of them were full of papers. I was sure that some of these papers were important. I had to look at all of them. This job will take a long time, I thought. It was too late to start work that afternoon. I looked at my watch. Keckwick was not coming back for another hour. I decided to walk back along the causeway. I was able to see the path from the window. It went straight ahead. It was not possible for me to lose my way. I was sure to meet Keckwick on the way. I went back into every room. I pulled down the blinds. I turned off all the lights. I locked the front door behind me. Then I started to walk along the causeway. Chapter 5. The Cry of a Child. Outside the house, everything was quiet. I looked back once, but I did not see the woman in black. The causeway was dry, but the tide was coming in. The water on either side of the causeway was higher now. As I walked on, I felt very alone. The path over the causeway seemed longer, too. I walked faster. The sky and the water were beautiful in the grey light. Then I saw the sea mist. The sea mist was moving quickly over the marshes. In a few moments, the sea mist covered everything. It was a damp, white mist. It was very different from the yellow fog of London. The mist moved about in front of my eyes. Soon my hair and clothes were wet. Now I saw only a short way in front of me. I looked back. I was not able to see Eel Marsh House. It had completely disappeared in the mist. I walked on very slowly. Then I stopped. If I went on, I might walk off the causeway into the deep mud. I decided to go back. But going back was difficult too. The mist was moving all round me. Where was the house? Was I going the right way? I felt very afraid. and then I heard the Pony and Trap. Thank God! Keckwick was coming back for me. I stopped and waited. But now the sounds of the Pony and Trap were going away from me. Now the sound was coming from somewhere on the marshes. What was wrong? Had Keckwick gone off the path? I stood very still. For a moment there was complete silence. Suddenly a pony shrieked with fear. Then I heard a sound I shall never forget. The terrible cry of a child in fear of death. And now the trap was sinking. There was a strange sucking sound. The trap was going down under the mud, and still the child cried out. There was nothing I could do. I shouted, but no one answered. How could I find the trap in that terrible mist? It was impossible. I had to get back to the house. If I turned on all the lights, someone might see them. Someone might help. It was dark now. The mist was thicker, too. I heard the sea-water moving nearer. At last I was standing on hard ground in front of the house. I found the front door and opened it. Behind me, the marshes were silent. I sat down on the nearest chair. I began to shake. Oh, the horror of that terrible cry! That poor child dying in the marshes! I began crying and was not able to stop. After a time, I made myself stand up. I walked into every room and turned on the lights. I found some brandy in a cupboard. I drank some, and my fear turned to anger. Why had Mr. Bentley sent me here? Why had I left London? I walked in and out of the rooms. I wanted only one thing. I wanted to get away from this terrible place. I walked slowly along a passage on the second floor. The door at the end was locked. I kicked the door angrily, but it did not open. I turned away and walked back. As I went, I looked through every window. The white sea mist was all around the house. I could see nothing. I drank some more brandy. The brandy helped me to forget that terrible sound of the child crying. At last, I fell asleep. A bell was ringing. It rang again and again. I opened my eyes slowly. I looked through the window. The moon shone white in the black sky. How long had I been asleep? I did not know. The bell rang again. Then I remembered with horror the sound I had heard. I remembered the screams of the child. I remembered the shrieks of the pony. I remembered the noise of the trap as it sank down in the mud. Had I heard those noises? Had I dreamt them? I did not know. The bell rang again. Someone was at the door. Who was there? All the lights in the house were on. People had seen the lights and come to help me. I got up slowly and walked to the door. There was only one man at the door. It was Keckwick, and behind him was his pony and trap. They were real, and they were not harmed at all. "I had to wait till the mist cleared," said Keckwick. "And when the mist cleared, the tide was in. I had to wait until the tide went out and the water left the causeway." Then I looked at my watch and saw the time. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. "It's very good of you to come here for me at this time," I said. "I would not have left you to stay here all night," Keckwick said. "No, no, I would not have left you here all night." "How did you get out of the mud?" I began to say. Then I knew. It had not been Keckwick. It had been someone else. But who? Who had been driving on the marshes on a dark November evening? Who? Keckwick looked at me strangely. "You'd better get in the trap," he said. "I'll drive you back." Keckwick knew that something strange had happened to me, but he was not going to ask me about it, and he did not want to hear about it. I got into the trap, and we drove off. I sat in the trap in a dream of horror and fear. I now knew the truth, but I did not want to believe it. The woman in black was a ghost, and the child was a ghost too. I had seen the woman. I had heard the child. They had died long ago, but they did not rest in peace. The innkeeper of the Gifford Arms had not gone to bed. He was waiting up for me. He let me in without a word. It was after 3 o'clock in the morning when I got to bed. I slept, but in my dreams I heard the cry of a child. I stood once more in the white sea mist, and always near me was the woman in black. Chapter 6. I Go Back. When I woke, the sun was shining. At first I felt weak and ill, but after a bath and breakfast I felt better. I was not going to run away. I had a job to do. I was afraid. I had seen and heard terrible things. But I was a young man, and young men forget easily. I was going back to Eelmarsh House. I was going to look at Mrs. Drablow's papers. But not today, and not alone. I wanted some exercise. I told the innkeeper I was going for a long walk.
"Can you ride a bicycle, sir?"
he said.
"There's a bicycle here you can use."
I was very pleased. Stella and I often rode bicycles into the country. Yes, an hour or two on a bicycle. That's what I needed. Then tomorrow I would go back to Eelmarsh House. But not alone. I decided to talk to Mr. Jerome. He probably had a boy who worked in the office. The boy can help me, I thought. Together we will finish the job quickly. I walked through the town to Mr. Jerome's office. He did not look pleased to see me. "The house is full of papers," I said. "I must look at them all. I need help." A look of fear came into Mr. Jerome's face.
"I can't help you, Mr. Kipps,"
he said quickly. "But can your office boy help me?" I said.
"I don't have an office boy,"
Jerome answered. "Well, any other boy in the town," I said. "I'll pay him, of course." Mr. Jerome stood up. His face was white.
"You will find no one to help you! No one!"
he shouted. "I think I understand you, Mr. Jerome," I said. "No one in this town will stay at Eelmarsh House. Everyone is too afraid of seeing—" I stopped.
"The woman in black?"
Mr. Jerome said. "Yes," I answered. "I saw her again."
"Where?"
he whispered. "In the graveyard behind Eelmarsh House. But she's not going to stop me, whoever she is, or was." I laughed. My laugh did not sound true. "I must be brave, Mr. Jerome," I added. I'm not going to run away."
"That's what I said,"
the little man replied very quietly. I did not understand him. "Well, I'll go back alone," I said. "Perhaps I'll not see the woman again."
"I pray that you do not,"
Mr. Jerome said slowly.
"I pray that you do not."
I went back to the inn. I wrote a letter to Mr. Bentley. I told him I wanted to stay for a few days. I said nothing about the woman in black. Then I took the bicycle and rode off. The weather was perfect for cycling. The wind was cold, but the air was bright and clear. I decided to ride west, away from the marshes. I was going to ride to the next village and have lunch there. At the end of the town, I looked to the east. I was looking back to the water of the marshes. The marshes were pulling me back. I knew I had to go back to them. But not now. Not today. Taking a deep breath, I turned my bicycle. My back was to the marshes now. I cycled away from the marshes along the country road. Chapter 7. Dinner with Mr. Daly. I rode back to Crythin Gifford about 4 hours later. I was feeling happier. Eelmarsh House did not frighten me now. I knew I was brave enough to go there alone. The sea mist and loneliness of the place had frightened me. How silly I had been to be afraid. That would not happen again. I turned the corner into the town square. A big car was coming towards me. I stopped quickly, but I almost fell off the bicycle. The car slowed down and stopped. Mr. Samuel Daly looked out of the window.
"How are you, young man?"
he called. "Fine," I said. "I've had a good ride. I feel hungry, and I'm looking forward to my dinner tonight."
"And what about your business? Have you been out to the house?"
"Yes, of course," I answered. "It won't take me long." Mr. Daly looked at me for a few moments. He said nothing. "I'm enjoying the work," I went on quickly. "It's all very interesting, but there are many papers to look at." Mr. Daly went on staring at me.
"Mr. Kipps," he said, "those are brave words, but I don't believe them. Come to my house for dinner tonight. The innkeeper knows where I live."
He sat back, and the car drove on. Mr. Daly's words did not make me change my mind. I was going back to Eelmarsh House. I went shopping in the town. I bought tea, coffee, and bread. Then a large torch and rubber boots. I wanted to be ready for anything at Eelmarsh House. I told the innkeeper what I was going to do. "Tomorrow," I said, "I'm going to go to Eelmarsh House. I'm going to stay there for 2 nights. Can I use your bicycle?" The innkeeper nodded. He said nothing, but he looked at me sadly. In the evening I cycled out to the Daly's house. It was a very large house. Mr. Daly was clearly a rich man. Mr. Daly and his wife gave me a friendly welcome. The food and drink were very good. All through dinner, Samuel Daly talked about himself. He had worked hard all his life. Now he owned land and houses. I told him about Stella and our plans for the future. After dinner, Mrs. Daly left us. Until then, Mr. Daly had not spoken about Mrs. Drablow or Eelmarsh House. He filled my glass and his own with wine.
"You're a fool to go on with it," he said.
I knew what he meant. "I've got a job to do, Mr. Daly," I said, "and I want to do it well."
"Listen to me, Arthur," Daly said. "There are stories about that place. Stories I'm not going to tell you. You'll hear them from other people. Perhaps you've heard them already. You've been out to the house, haven't you?"
"Yes, I've been there," I answered, "and I heard and saw things I cannot understand." And then I told him everything. Mr. Daly listened carefully, but said nothing. "I think the woman in black is a ghost," I said. "She made me afraid. She has the power to make people afraid. But that is all. She did me no harm."
"And what about the pony and trap? The child's cry?" Daly asked.
Yes, I thought to myself, the child's cry was the worst of all. But I did not say that to Mr. Daly. "I'm not running away," I said.
"You shouldn't go back," Daly said.
"I must."
"Then don't go alone."
"No one will go with me," I answered. "I'll be all right. After all, Mrs. Drablow lived there alone for 60 years.
"Alone? I wonder," Mr. Daly said.
He stood up. It was time for me to go. A servant brought my coat. When the man had left, Daly said,
"Are you really going back to that house?"
"I am," I answered.
"Then, if you must go, take a dog," Daly said.
I laughed. "I haven't got a dog," I said.
"But I have a dog," Daly answered. "You can take her with you now."
We walked out of the house together.
"Wait here a moment," Daly said.
He walked round to the back of the house. I stood there, smiling. I liked dogs. I was happy to have a dog with me in that empty old house. After a few moments, Daly returned with a bright-eyed little dog.
"Take her," he said. "Bring her back when you've finished."
"What's her name?"
"Spider."
Hearing her name, the little dog wagged her tail. "Thank you," I said.
"Come on, girl. Come on, Spider."
I began to walk away. The dog did not move. She looked at Daly.
"Go on, girl,"
he said. Spider ran over to me at once. Waving goodbye, I got on my bicycle. Then, with Spider running behind me, I rode back to the town. I felt happy and safe. I was looking forward to the morning. Chapter 8. Sounds in the Night. Next day the weather was good. At 9 o'clock Mr. Bentley phoned from London. "I've received your letter," he said. "You can stay for a few days. Send me any papers that look important. Leave the other papers in the house. Don't stay too long." "I'll finish the work as quickly as I can," I answered. "It's a strange old house," I added. "Mrs. Drablow was a strange old woman," Mr. Bentley said, and he put the phone down. By 9:30 I was ready. There was a basket on the front of the bicycle. I put everything in the basket. I cycled off happily. The little dog, Spider, ran along behind me. The tide was coming in. Very soon it would cover the causeway. But that did not worry me. The air was clear. The sun was shining on the water. Seabirds were flying and calling over the estuary. I was soon at Eelmarsh House. I opened the windows. I lit fires in several rooms. Then I sat down at a big desk. The desk was in front of a window. I could see the sky, the marshes, and the water. I started work. The desk was full of papers. Most of them I threw away, but I kept a few to look at later. I opened a cupboard, and then another. Papers. More and more papers. I looked at everything carefully. I worked hard all the morning. At 2 o'clock I had some lunch. Then I called Spider, and we went outside. I walked down to the old graveyard. Spider ran up and down. She was happy too. I tried to read the words on the gravestones, but they were too old. Most of the words were difficult to read. The writing on one stone was a little clearer. Some letters were worn away, but I could read most of the words. 2 people were buried here. I wondered who they had been. I looked around me. It was